This is Deb, and I'm just going to walk you through some of the finer points of Chapter 10 that'll help you get this whole genetics off to a good start.
Gregor Mendel, he was a numbers guy. He saw things in numbers, and that is why he became the father of all of our genetic research and the things that we see that are true today. He was born to parents that were farmers, and as he became older, became an Austrian monk. But he always loved physics and science. So while he was a monk, he started working with pea plants, and he started crossing them and seeing what traits would come out. He was very interested in this, and since he loved numbers, if you know numbers people, they remember anything about you that has a number associated with it, but they might not remember your name. So these numbers, number people are kind of wired that way, I think, and so he saw everything through those numbers. And we'll see coming backwards that it was pretty amazing that he did that. So he started working with pea plants in the garden of the monastery. Why pea plants? They were really easy to get. They were easy to grow. He could get lots of generations in short order versus animals. I mean, that takes so long for them to go through gestation and be born and become an adult, and then they can have children, and so it becomes too timely, too costly in time. So he could go pea plants, generation, fast, fast, fast. He could pollinate it by hand, so he knew exactly what he had. Lots of varieties. He chose 10 specific ones, and they were true breeding. What does that mean? The offspring were like the parent plants and like each other. You'll find out soon that that means they were homozygous, and if they're homozygous, homo means the same, then they produce that trait in their offspring. It passed down. We're going to talk about dominant, it's expressed by the capital R, and recessive, expressed by the little r in our Punnett squares, for example. So a true breeding would have a dominant allele from mom, a dominant allele from dad, and so ends up with capital RR. And then a recessive trait would be two recessive traits together. And so the kind of things he looked at were tall and short and plump and wrinkled and green and yellow and flower color and pod color. And these are the traits exactly that he looked at. And you'll see that this row across the top is dominant. This row across the bottom is recessive. So he kept records of those experiments and those numbers. And he saw it in numbers. And the whole business about being able to pollinate by hand, here's how you do it. So let's look at the flower. So we have the stigma and the anther and the ovary, right? Pollen is produced in the anther, these little guys right here. And then it goes down through the stigma into the ovary, and pollen has sperm in it, and so it goes down in here, and this is fertilized eggs down here. All right, but we don't want that plant to do that, and we want to control what does it. So we cut those away, and then we take the pollen from the anthers of another plant and brush them on the top, and then cover it up with a paper bag so nothing else can get there, and then we know exactly what those traits were. All right, for example, tall and short. This is one of the first ones he did. F1 means first generation. So he crossed a tall plant with a short plant. Guess what? He got all tall. He was confused. Why were they all tall? Did the shortness just disappear? Then he took those offspring, the F1 generation, are the first generation of offspring, both tall, remember, and he crossed them, and this time he got a ratio of 3 tall to 1 short. This guy's about numbers, remember? So here are his real numbers. And for example, tall and short, he had 787 plants that were tall, 277 that were recessive. And if you look down this list, you'll see that that's generally a 3-to-1 ratio. He counted so many peas because more data is valid. That's extremely important in all of science, to have enough data to support, so some small anomaly can't change things for you. Okay, now let's talk about some terminology that'll help you with your human genetics lab. Allele. That's just the alternate form of a gene. All of us that are diploid, we have two genes for each trait. We have 2 alleles for each trait. For example, let's look at this flower. Like this one came from the sperm from dad, this one came from the egg from mom, and they both have the allele for the color of the flower. And on mom, this comes the white, and from dad comes purple. But those are the alleles for flower color gene. Okay, so the alleles are the different versions, alternate possibilities kind of a thing. Now let's talk about homozygous versus heterozygous. Homo means the same. So this means the 2 alleles are the same. Hetero means different. The 2 alleles are different. Let's look at examples here. All right, so let's say this came from mom, this came from dad. For this specific trait, got a capital P from mom, a capital P from dad. So they're homozygous, they're the same. For the dominant, the capital one means that's the dominant allele, which we'll see in a minute. This trait from mom got the recessive, the lowercase a. From dad, the recessive as well. So this is also homozygous, 2 little a's for the recessive gene. And remember when we talked about true breeding, that's what we're talking about. These homozygous, either dominant or recessive, passed down perfectly. All right, then on this last one, this organism has got the dominant allele from mom and the recessive from dad. So their genotype for that trait is capital B, little b. Hetero, which means different, so it's heterozygous. So let's look at some of your things on your handout. Let's look at tongue rolling. And by the way, all of us have used this to teach genetics forever because it's fun and easy. But as you do your research at the end of this, you'll find out there's some problems with it. It's really not a true trait. It's definitely impacted by genetics, but you'll find out. All right, so homozygous, 2 alleles are the same. So tongue rolling. If you can roll your tongue, that's a dominant trait, so that's capital R. If you can't roll your tongue, that's recessive. You've got the recessive trait. That's a little r. So for homozygous, for that trait, you could either be 2 capital R's or 2 little r's. Freckles. Freckles are dominant, capital F. No freckles, little f. So homozygous for that trait could either be capital F, or little f, little f. Now, heterozygous means different, so for those both traits, you could only be big R, little r, or big F, little f. All right? That's just to learn that terminology. Now let's talk a little bit more about dominance. So if there's a dominant gene, it has the ability to mask the expression of the other allele. So let's look at ability to roll your tongue. R, capital R. If you have the ability to roll your tongue, that means you have a dominant trait, a dominant gene from either your mom or dad. You don't have to have it from both, but you could. But if there's one there, you can roll your tongue out of the 2. If there's 1 capital F out of your 2 alleles for the freckle gene, you got freckles because that's dominant. That will take over and make you have that phenotype or that physical trait. Recessive. That means this is a guy that we can't see it. You won't express it in your phenotype unless there's 2 of them together. So if this R is with that R, you're going to be able to roll your tongue. But if you have 2 little R's together, got one from mom, one from dad, then you cannot roll your tongue. 2 recessive F's, no freckles. So let's look at the possibilities here. Rolling your tongue. 2 capital R's, you can roll your tongue. Big R, little r, let's think about that. 2 little r's, you can't roll your tongue. Same thing happening for the F. So if you have only 1 dominant gene in your genotype, you express that dominant trait. It only takes 1 because this one is masking that recessive right there. So capital R, little r, you can roll your tongue. Capital F, little f, you have freckles. So let's look at a few more examples. So freckles is dominant to no freckles, big F, little f. The phenotype, remember, is what it looks like. So let's say you have freckles. So what could be your actual alleles for your genotype? Well, you know you're going to be two capital F's, but you'll also could be a big F, little f. We don't know for sure, because this guy will mask that little f. So anytime you have the dominant trait on your handout, your genotype possibilities must be the two options, homozygous dominant and heterozygous. So let's say you don't have freckles. That means you're the recessive trait. You only can be two little f's, because if there was any big F in there with that, if it was heterozygous, you would have freckles. So the only way you can have a recessive trait is if you're double recessive there in your genotype. Dimples, let's do another one. To have dimples as dominant, no dimples is recessive. So let's say you don't have dimples. What must be your genotype? No dimples, recessive? Yeah, it has to be two little d's. I don't have any dimples at all. My dad and my sister have them like crazy, but I must be two little d's.